trabajando, él tiene formalmente tiene una formación postdoctoral en la Universidad de Toronto, en filosofía, y ha estado trabajando en la Universidad de Berkeley, y ahora, a partir de enero, va a empezar como profesor asistente en la Universidad de Virginia, ahí donde algunos de ustedes han escuchado de los eventos de los últimos días. Zachary es filósofo, como les digo, de formación, pero ha trabajado en temas asociados a la divagación mental, un poco desde el punto de vista más teórico, pero también experimental. Tiene artículos con gente del calibre de Kalina Christoph, también trabajó con, tenemos un advisor de postdoc en común, así fue como nos conocimos, que es Evan Thompson, y su presentación de hoy día está pensada un poquito en un público pensando como psicología, cierto, neurociencias, pero también con la posibilidad de hacer algunos excursos hacia los aspectos más filosóficos, si se diera el caso, ¿ya? Así que muchas gracias, Zach. Thank you very much. Su presentación va a ser en inglés, se los habíamos avisado, pero si necesitan de apoyo en alguna traducción o algo, avisen, no hay ningún problema. ¿Ya?
Gracias. Yeah, thank you very much for coming. Lo siento por presentar en inglés. Mi español es muy roto. So what I study is mind wandering, or daydreaming, or I think it's soñar is in Spanish.
Ensoñación. Soñar is the dream.
Oh, okay.
It's the actual dream.
Yeah, okay. So it's daydreaming. And I want to know what that is, what mind wandering is. And I want to know also how we can measure it. This is a project that brings together philosophy and psychology, so it's really a project in interdisciplinary cognitive science. So philosophers have for centuries been fascinated by the stream of consciousness. So those images or memories or little bits of inner speech that wander before your mind. And yet, for centuries, this mind wandering was deemed essentially private, and thus it's resistant to empirical investigation. I think that's changed in the last 20 years with an emerging science of mind wandering, and very recently a philosophy of mind wandering. I actually, as a personal note, found out about this work from Diego. We had a reading group where we read a paper by Diego on the stream of consciousness 10 years ago, and this is when I started to think that this was a fascinating topic that I could study empirically. So what I'm going to tell you about today is a research program where we've come up with a theory of mind wandering, and we hope that this theory is philosophically precise, is empirically testable, and is grounded in the brain. So my theory says that mind wandering, this is my philosophical work, I argue that mind wandering is unguided thinking. So roughly, thinking is, so the idea is that because mind wandering is not guided to remain on topic, when you daydream, when your mind wanders, you wander from one topic to another. That's why mind wandering moves in the kind of way that it does. And we've, in collaboration with neuroscientists, I've argued that that sort of guidance arises due to the interactions of large-scale neural networks, and thus that the mind wanders during periods where those interactions subside. So today what I'm going to tell you about is a couple empirical questions that have arisen from that sort of theory or that framework for thinking about mind wandering. One of the questions is just how ordinary people understand mind wandering, so how they understand that term. Because all the stuff I'm going to tell you about in the first half of the talk, which is just theory, it's just philosophy and theoretical neuroscience, all of that is just based on a theorist like me, my technical intuitions about what mind wandering is. But that might be very different from how the term mind wandering and the concept mind wandering is understood by real people out there in the world. So I want to know whether my intuitions line up with how ordinary people understand the concept. The second part of the talk is on how you could measure a wandering mind. So if we're going to have a theory be scientifically tractable, something that we can actually test in experiments, we need to have good methods for measuring mind wandering. And so what I'm going to tell you about is the current methods just can't quite do so, or at least can't measure mind wandering in the way that I define it. And what I'm going to introduce you to is a novel called thought sampling methods. These are methods for introspection that we can use, I think, to measure the wandering stream of consciousness. And I think that these projects are a first step towards empirically studying something that's remained elusive for centuries, the stream of consciousness. So, this is the talk. We're going to start off with the theory that I reject in my theory, and then the theory that I propose, and then we're going to look at 2 experiments that are motivated by those theories. So, the current view of mind wandering. So before I get into the sort of technical views that have been proposed in philosophy and psychology, I want to give you a vignette or an example of what I mean when I talk about mind wandering, of the kind of phenomenon that interests me. So let's say you're in a talk. Let's say you're in this talk. And you know, the topic really excites you, and I'm a lively speaker maybe, but yet your mind just won't be still. So first, the thought of maybe sneaking away for some tea gives way to slides from a presentation that you're going to give tomorrow, and then you think about a camping trip that you want to go on next week and how excited you are to see the mountains. So my question, so the central question in my philosophical work is what makes that mind wandering? So the standard answer in psychology is that that's mind wandering because it is task unrelated. So mind wandering in the standard definition is thought that's not related to any of your current tasks or what you're currently doing. So in that vignette, say when you think about sneaking away for coffee, or you think about the slides that you're going to make, that counts as mind wandering because it's unrelated to your task of paying attention to the talk. So one of the reasons that this definition is so powerful is that it's easy to measure task unrelated thought. We have methods that work for doing so. Those methods are called thought sampling. So what you do is you'll as someone is going about an experimental task, or as they're just going about their daily lives, you'll interrupt them at pseudo-random intervals. And what you'll do is you'll ask them questions about their preceding experiences. So in the lab, one of the most common questions is, was your attention focused on the experimental task? And if you say no, you count as mind wandering. In the world, you might ask, in studies of mind wandering where someone's going about their daily lives and you interrupt them with questions on their cell phone. And you might ask, was your mind wandering to something other than what you were doing? And if you say yes, then you count as mind wandering. So that's a sort of standard definition way of defining mind wandering, of measuring it, and that's led to a really productive stream of empirical research in psychology that's just been growing exponentially over the last 20 years. So I want to bring up a problem for that definition, which is that it neglects the dynamics of mind wandering. It neglects how the mind wanders, how it moves over time. I want to say that when your mind wanders, that's characterized by a type of movement. So this goes back to a lot of the earliest psychologists who talked about mind wandering, like Théodore Ribot and William James. So Ribot said that mind wandering, or distraction, is characterized by the incessant transition from one idea to another. So in that vignette that I gave you, that example that I gave you, your mind wanders from coffee, you think about one moment, and then you think about your slides, and then you think about camping. And it's this sort of incessant transitions that at least largely defines what it means for your mind to wander. Now, this is also reflected in the words that we use to talk about mind wandering in various European languages. So this isn't something that you're supposed to do as a philosopher, this isn't common practice, but I'm going to cite the dictionary. So when you look at the dictionary definition of wandering, it means to move hither and thither without fixed course or certain aim, or to be in motion without control or direction. So to say that someone's mind is wandering is to say that their mind is moving hither and thither, that it's moving without aim, course, or direction. And that's to say something about its dynamics. This is also reflected in the Spanish term, or one of the Spanish terms for mind wandering, dejar volar la imaginación. Sorry. Let your imagination run wild, right? It's this talk of this sort of dynamics of movement. This running has something to do with movement, and that's reflected in a lot of different European languages. I think French, Danish, German. So a lot of the way we talk about mind wandering implies that it involves a kind of movement, this sort of dispersed movement, this wild movement. And the problem is, by saying that your thoughts are unrelated to a talk, say, or unrelated to your current task, that doesn't say anything about this kind of movement that defines mind wandering. So to see why, consider that task-unrelated thought can come in just many varieties, some of which don't move in the way that I've talked about at all. So, so think about when you're at a conference and you're thinking about something other than the speaker. One thing your mind might be doing is it might be sort of wandering or drifting from one topic to another, from coffee to your slides and so on. But at the same time, when you're not thinking of the speaker, you might be thinking in a highly constrained and goal-directed manner. So you might be, for example, working methodically and deliberately through a to-do list. Now, you're not thinking about what the speaker is saying, so your mind counts as wandering on the standard definition, and yet your thoughts look very different from what we ordinarily think of as mind wandering. You also might be, instead of wandering from one thing to another, you might be stuck on your distress. You might be ruminating. Is a sort of clinical case of this sort of sticky thoughts, where, say, you're thinking over and over and over again about a fight that you just had with your friend. So because your thoughts were task unrelated, they count as mind wandering on the standard definition, and yet I want to say that they lack a paradigmatic feature of mind wandering, that is, the movement from one topic to another. So I think that there's something that our theories really should try and capture that they currently don't on our theories of mind wandering, which is how the wandering stream of consciousness moves over time. So I think to give an account of mind wandering, we need to start theorizing about the stream of consciousness, and we need to start thinking about how we could measure the movement of thought. So, in my theories, I've tried to do just that. So, my philosophical work, I've argued that mind wandering is unguided attention, is what I call it, or unguided thinking. So here's the idea. What I mean by guidance is really the central notion from my view. That's this notion that I get from the philosophy of action. So guidance concerns how behavior or how thought is monitored and regulated as it unfolds over time. So it has something to do with the sort of dynamics of thought and how thought is, or behavior is, like kept in place or kept in check. So here's an example of guidance that I talk about that I think is a useful analogy to the sort of guidance of thought. So let's say, so this analogy is about conversational norms, about how close you stand to someone you're talking with. So let's say you're standing what seems to you too close to a conversational partner. So the example I'd like to give of this is, if any of you watch Seinfeld, the close talker from Seinfeld is someone who like stands right up in your face, and it feels really uncomfortable when someone is doing that. And you're you're motivated to step, you feel uncomfortable, and you're thereby motivated or drawn to step back from that close talker. So crucially, what's going on here is, in order to understand how your behavior is guided by these norms of not standing too close, you can't just look at how someone actually happens to behave when they're standing the right distance. You also need to look at a counterfactual. You need to look at how someone would respond if their behavior were to deviate from some standard. So if someone was standing too close, would this feel to you like it was wrong? And would you thereby be drawn to correct this problem? And that's what's essential to guidance, is that counterfactual notion. Now, so guidance generally involves how you would respond to deviant behavior. Guidance of thinking involves how you would respond to deviant thoughts, namely distractions. So my idea is that when your thinking is guided, let's say you're really intently paying attention to this conversation, to this talk, or you're intently paying attention to conversation you're having on your smartphone. If you were distracted by something, like say a fly buzzing in the corner, you would feel pulled back to that conversation on your smartphone, to what you're guided to attend to. And so when your attention is goal directed, say you're really intently working through a to-do list, you would feel pulled back if you were distracted by, say, a fly buzzing in the corner. Similarly, I think when you're ruminating, when you're fixated on something, even if you don't want to feel pulled back, if you think of something else, you get pulled back to your distress. So say you're thinking about a really bad conversation that you just had with a close friend. If you for a moment are able to think about something else, like something happy, you feel sort of pulled back to the, I think, the prediction is that you feel pulled back to that bad conversation. And it's that pulled back that's how your thoughts are regulated. That's how your thoughts are guided. So I think that mind wandering is unguided attention or unguided thinking, in that when your wandering mind drifts from one topic to another, when you at first think of coffee and then slides and then your camping trip, say, nothing pulls you back, right? You just keep drifting on to another topic unchecked. So it's because there's nothing that guides you to remain in place when your mind wanders that you have that kind of movement that's characteristic of the wandering mind, where you drift from one topic to another. So this is supposed to capture this is supposed to explain this lack of guidance, this crucial feature of the wandering stream of consciousness, namely how it moves over time. So what I've argued in my empirical collaborations is I've given a sort of account of how this sort of guidance and how this unguided thinking might be realized in the brain. So what's the background for this account is something called the default network. So has anyone heard of the default network? Yeah. So it's this network that, like, the defining, or what people used to say was the defining feature of this, and this is not exactly correct, but it's that it's a network that's like active when you're not doing anything, when you're at rest. When people, the way that they discovered it is in neuroscience, what you would do and still often the case, you'd always, in a contrastive analysis in neuroscience, you always compare what people are doing when they're doing a task to what they're doing when they're told to sit there and do nothing in the fMRI scanner. But then in the early 2000s, people discovered that brain activity, and people always thought the brain activity when you're doing nothing would be random, or nothing would be going on. It would just be sort of a baseline of where your brain isn't really doing anything. But it turns out that there's one network, the default network, that's more active when you're not doing anything than it is when you're doing a wide variety of tasks. This isn't universally true, but it's a general statement. It's correct. And this network is also active when your mind is wandering. So it led people to theorize that the default network is what your mind does, what your brain does when it's not doing anything at all, when it's at rest or when it's wandering. So one of the things that subnetworks of the default network that we focused on was the medial temporal lobe. So the hippocampus and the parahippocampus. These are regions that, or a subnetwork that's capable of reactivating a remembered experience, or capable of activating new imagined experiences. So it's a network that's capable of activating a sort of large ensemble of cortical activity that's required for you to have the kind of imagined experiences and the kind of memories that you have when your mind wanders. Now, this subnetwork can be constrained or can be guided in a top-down fashion by various other networks in the brain. So when you're engaged in goal-directed thought, and this is a little bit of a simplification, but when you're engaged in goal-directed thought, the frontal parietal control network, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and other regions that are connected to it, they can constrain what memories and imaginative experiences you have in a goal-directed fashion, so that you're guided to focus on the things that are relevant for the goals that you're holding in mind. Or when you have these sort of affective experiences that where you're drawn to something that's affectively salient over and over again, we're proposing that at least the ventral attentional networks and the salience networks are sort of constraining the memories and imaginative experiences you have. So this would look pretty familiar from, are you guys familiar with the sort of the distinction between like top-down and bottom-up attentional networks that you would see in, say, Corbetta and Schulman? Now, where I think we're doing something that was relatively novel, is we argue that the mind wanders during periods where those interactions subside. So just saying that there's sort of, which is the standard view in sort of cognitive neuroscience of attention, that there's top-down attention, like goal-directed attention, and bottom-up attention, where you're drawn to salient things, that's not enough. Because there's another type of attention where your mind is just wandering from one thing to another. So what we think happens here is that the default network, so that's able of generating memories and imaginative experiences, what it does when it's not constrained in a top-down fashion is it generates a sort of associative chain of experiences, where first you're thinking about coffee, then you're thinking about slides, and then you're thinking about a camping trip that you're going to go on. And it's this kind of chain of imaginings and memories that's really at the heart of what we think of as a sort of wandering stream of consciousness. So it's this unconstrained mode of sort of default network, and specifically medial temporal lobe default network function that's underlying this core aspect of the stream of consciousness, is this sort of neuroscientific view. So what I think you found here, and I'll pause now for questions about theoretical stuff because I'll go into empirical studies next, is a view in philosophy and a view in theoretical neuroscience that I hope are mutually reinforcing. So they're not supposed to be independent. What they're supposed to do is that the philosophy, they each give you different pieces of the puzzle. So the philosophy gives you an account of the experience of mind wandering, or the personal level experience of what it is for a person to mind wander and what that feels like. And it also gives you an account that hopefully is analytically precise, or like conceptually precise, and that's actually going to be crucial, we'll see, when we turn to actually designing experiments that are about to measure mind wandering or people's beliefs about mind wandering, is that you really have to be able to be precise about what mind wandering is, to give the kind of instructions you need for people to answer questions about their own thoughts, or to design the kind of stimuli you need to be able to distinguish between mind wandering and goal-directed thinking. On the other hand, without the neuroscience, you don't get a theory that's psychologically real. It's not grounded in anything, in real psychology or in the brain, unless it's not clear that it's testable. So what you get from the neuroscientific view is a way to turn this philosophical work into a real scientific project. And then I think also to inform the philosophy. It might be that the neuroscience informs the philosophy in ways that the philosophical view has to change. So I see these as two reinforcing parts of a sort of circular project that, that's going to develop by looking at both levels. But going forward, what I want to do, and these are the empirical projects that I'll talk about for the remainder of the talk, is some empirical questions that arise from this. So one, as I told you before, this view of mind wandering as unguided thinking is just based on sort of my theoretical or a priori intuitions, right? But it might be that what I call mind wandering isn't at all what anyone else calls mind wandering. So I actually wanted to go out and test that. This is a work in experimental philosophy, actually test our intuitions in the real world. I also wanted to see how you could measure mind wandering in my sense, because there aren't currently good methods for doing that. And thus how you can, and that's required to study it empirically. So does anyone have questions about the theory before I move on? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting theory, and I love the idea that when we are off task, we can be doing like different things, and
Yeah.
one of them is
Yeah.
I really love that. But then I was wondering whether we could even go like forward on that.
Okay.
I think that
Sure.
mind wandering could include going back and forth to the task.
Yeah.
You know, it's like
Yeah,
if I'm listening
yeah,
to it,
yeah.
like I could
Yeah.
be thinking of coffee and then doing the slides
Yeah.
and then coming back to.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think that there might, so this is just like totally preliminary evidence, but I saw a talk about a month ago that might suggest that that's the case. And I also cut something that was really relevant to that, another objection. So there's, so weirdly, I think in a classroom setting, people when they're deliberately, when they're mind wandering, they actually don't do a lot worse than when they're not mind wandering. And one reason might be that when your mind wanders, you're able to sort of like come back and into the conversation. Now, that would still count as mind wandering on my view, because what's crucial for mind wandering is not what you're thinking about, whether you're thinking about the talk or not, but rather whether your thought is guided to remain on the talk over time. So the idea would be that when your mind is wandering, you're having this sort of stream of thoughts or memories and imaginings, and you could also have perceptual thoughts where you pay attention to the talk every, 5 or 6 thoughts or something like that. But that actually might be a very different mode of paying attention to a talk than when you're sort of goal directed. And I think that actually fits into, Diego, what you were telling me about so Diego had an idea that I really liked, that maybe you guys have that idea, Karen, I'm not sure if you're collaborating on this, but that mind wandering while reading might actually make you sort of more creative in your understanding of a text. And I think that sounds, if you understand mind wandering in this dynamic way, so where mind wandering involves wandering from one topic to another, that actually might really make sense, right? So if you're just paying attention to a text and you don't allow yourself to think about anything that text sort of is associated with or anything that pops into your mind, then yeah, you're going to understand the text, but you're not going to bring anything new into it. Whereas if your mind is allowed to if you allow your mind to sort of wander from the text to something else and then wander around for a little bit and then come back to the text, you might be able to bring new things into the text that you otherwise wouldn't have seen. So I think that this kind of view of mind wandering both allows that you can think about, you can wander back and forth from your task to mind wandering, and also explains why that might be a really good thing for you to do.
Yeah, just a second question.
Sure.
The idea of unguided thought,
Sure.
I mean, I kind of buy into that, but I'm not sure if this is kind of completely unguided. I know just said about like the neuroscience of it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I mean, when you are kind of turning off your system, still there are some things that are prevalent. I mean, for instance, if I have, I don't know, if I'm super tired, I'll be aware that I'm tired, and then that is going to get into my wondering, and not just a random thought.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So that's really good. So in the larger version of this philosophical view, which I cut down so I could talk about more empirical studies, there's this distinction between guidance and what I call motivation. So guidance involves whether your thoughts are regulated. So whether, if you were to think about a distraction, you get pulled back. But that's consistent with you with your thoughts not being random, right? And mind wandering really isn't random. Like if you look at, your mind wanders to your goals all the time, right? So if your mind wanders, if you think about something else during the talk, your mind really is wandering, you're probably going to think about things that matter to you, right? Like people that matter to you, or projects that matter to you, or aspects of your schooling or your job that matters to you. And that's consistent with mind wandering being unguided, because that just has to do with how likely it is that you're going to move to one thing or another, not that there's sort of some regulatory mechanism that keeps you in place that will like send out an error signal and bring you back if you think about something that's unrelated to your topic. Does that make sense? If that doesn't make sense to anyone, please speak for that. Sure.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't think that I truly understand.
Sure.
Maybe it's because of my language,
Okay.
But
Well, it could be because of
what
the
I
theory.
do understand maybe is
Yeah.
that the mind wandering is something you do unwillingly while doing a task, and it can take you, maybe for me, for different levels of your mind. For example, if, I don't know, I'm distracted for a word that's in your slide and can launch a memory or something, and then, okay, whatever, I can put it away. But I don't know if everyone feels the same, but there are some times while listening that I can get lost in my own mind and not forgetting, but not paying attention on anything, not even the sounds of the words or the things that are happening. Like I'm blind and I can't hear anything that's happening around me. So I don't know if you measure or think about a level of mind thinking or not.
Yeah, that's good. So that's actually one of the main things that people do study in the current literature that I haven't been talking about here, is they call it perceptual decoupling. So the extent to which you're just not aware of what's going on around you. And that can vary, I think, in mind wandering. So what I'm not going to talk about, but I can gesture towards when I'm talking about the empirical research, is that I think that whether or not you're aware of what your surroundings, actually comes apart from this sort of dynamic notion of mind wandering that I have in mind. So just as you said, sorry, your name is Hector? And Daniela. Okay, sorry. I know it. My Spanish is so terrible. But yeah, just as Hector pointed out, when your mind is wandering, you might be so sometimes when you have this sort of thoughts that are drifting from one topic to another, you might be drifting from paying attention to me to paying attention to other stuff in your perceptual environment, like the chairs around you, the people around you, to your thoughts. And other times you might be completely lost in your thoughts, where you have this wandering train of thoughts that's completely memories, that's completely imagining. So that can differ. But I think that both of those kinds of cases can count as mind wandering. And that's actually, from pilot data that I'm not going to present here, that's actually seems to be what ordinary people think too, at least in MTurk in English, is that your mind can wander even though it's wandering from one thing in the perceptual environment to another thing, to another thing, to another thing. And the data also suggests that in looking at experience, that people actually do have experiences where their thoughts are wandering from one thing to another, even though they're paying attention to the perceptual environment. So I think that's a really important dimension of thought, but I think that it's separable from this dynamic notion of how your thoughts are moving over time. But it's like one of the most studied things in mind wandering research. Yeah.
So far, I think that you are trying to make a definition of mind wandering.
Exactly. Yeah.
Trying to extend what has been thought of mind wandering, give a wider explanation, but not on why this happens. What would be the reason why we are in your research? Is there any step towards that direction?
So that's the goal. That was actually part of why I started working on this, is because I wanted to give an explanation of why, and I just haven't done it yet. Here's the basic story: is that that I obviously have to fill in a lot. Is that when you're it's really important that your thinking can sometimes be guided to remain on topic. Why? Because it's important that you can think about here in these different categories. Let me see if So it's important here that you can think about goals and you can focus on goals sometimes. That you can focus on goals that you really want to think about. It's also important sometimes that you focus on things maybe you don't really choose to think about them, but they're really important to you, like your relationships with other people, or like things that are really bothering you and really emotionally salient. It's important that we're capable to spend a lot of time focusing on those things, and thus that we're guided to do so. But if you were always to do that, you might be wrong about what's actually important to you, right? Your goals might make you focus on things that your goals might, but when your thinking is guided, it necessarily focuses you on what you think is relevant to your goals, but you might be just wrong. Think about cases where we have a creative insight, where we think that we think that a paper should work one way, and then we only focus on one way of writing a paper, and then suddenly it occurs to us that there's a different way of writing the paper that's much better, that there's a better way of understanding our data. I think that kind of default network mode, we're sort of wandering from one thing to another, because it's not guided by our preconceptions about what's relevant to our goals, or our preconceptions about what's emotionally relevant, that it can lead to these sort of often irrelevant ideas, but sometimes really important creative insights. So that's kind of the picture that I want to push about why our minds wander, is because it allows us to step outside our preconceptions about what's going to be important or what's going to be relevant. That's the picture that I want to argue for, but I haven't done that well.
Sorry, have you thought if there is maybe like a threshold, like over that threshold maybe you just get to a pathological level?
Yes.
Or you really cannot really focus on any goal, but beneath that maybe you really can make these connections and then come back and improve your whatever you're doing, right?
Absolutely. So in the part of the Nature Review Neuroscience article I'm not telling you about was precisely the article, the part on pathology. So one of the things that we argued was that that we can understand various disorders as a sort of extreme versions of these sort of ordinary variants in thought. So ADHD, we argued, was a sort of extremely unconstrained or unguided thought, right? So more of the time when you have ADHD, like me, I'm kind of ADHD spectrum, you have a lot of thoughts that you do a lot of crazy things because you can't focus on your goals, but that can also make you more creative, right? And then we also argued that depression and rumination looks like a sort of overabundance of constraints or guidance from the sort of ventral attentional and salience networks and limbic regions as well. So we actually did think that we can characterize, that this framework helps us characterize different sort of cognitive disorders as what they have in common is that they affect how the sort of stream of thought moves over time, and extreme versions of that can actually be pathological. Yeah, so I think that's a really important part of the framework.
What's your view on attention drifts while
Sure.
in, for example, a mindful state in which I can be at first paying attention to my breathing, then maybe what I feel in my hands, then maybe what I'm seeing, what I'm smelling, what I'm hearing. Because your first theory was mind wandering as unguided attention, but it then evolved to mind wandering as spontaneous thought. So the jump from attention to thought, what happens to all the feelings you might be paying attention to, but maybe they don't can be cataloged as complex thought.
Right. So I actually still use the word mind wandering as unguided attention. And the only reason I don't use it is because my neuroscience collaborators really don't like it when I talk about attention in that way. So I still think it really is attention, and I think that the case of like mindfulness is actually a really good, there's stuff that's really interesting. That's one of the other pieces of work that I would like to do, is actually look at the relationship between mind wandering as I've defined it and sort of mindfulness meditation. I think that relationship would really depend on the kind of meditation that you're talking about. This is the sort of oversimplification, but two kinds of meditation in Tibetan practices that have been really popular in the West are sort of focused awareness meditation, where you're really focusing on your breath, and you're supposed to be focused on one thing and nothing else goes into your mind, and that's going to be, I'm predicting, like highly constrained by the sort of those sort of top-down control networks. There's another type of meditation that's really popular in Tibetan practices, which is open monitoring meditation, is what it's often called, where you're just supposed to, what you're doing is you're not allowing your mind to get stuck on anything. So I think that you're not allowing this sort of affective salience to sort of happen. You have these sticky thoughts. Rather, you're allowing just whatever comes to your mind, as long as it's not sticky, come before your mind. So you're allowing yourself to have this sort of experiences that I think look a whole lot like mind wandering. So I think this other conception of, often when you look in the meditation literature, you see, oh, mind wandering is just the opposite of mindfulness, right? But I think it really depends on how you define mind wandering. That might be true if you have task-unrelated thought, but I don't think it's true when you define mind wandering in the way that I'm defining it in terms of unguided thinking. I think that a lot of focus of types of meditation, this is also true for Dzogchen is a type of meditation as well that I think is really consistent with this. A lot of types of meditation, what they do is they promote and they maintain a sort of state of mind wandering where your mind isn't guided towards anything in particular, even though you're trying to maintain this mode of thought where you're guiding, where you're moving freely from one thing to another. But yeah, that's I hope to write that in a paper like this fall, but we'll see. Okay. Anyone? That's great. Okay. So on to the empirical stuff. So I really want to look at when I say what mind wandering means, and I have an empirical project, I want to look at what mind wandering means to ordinary people and how you can measure it. So the first project on what mind wandering means. So so far what I've given you is a philosophical and theoretical argument that mind wandering isn't the same thing as task-unrelated thought, that they can come apart. But look, that's just, as I told you, that's based on philosophical intuitions, right? And those are notoriously unreliable. So it might be that ordinary people believe that mind wandering just is the same thing as task-unrelated thought, or maybe that they agree with my view. So I wanted to actually go out and test that. This is a sort of standard experiment in experimental philosophy, which is looking at what people's actual intuitions are. And I think that this can be a valuable point of data when we're going and constructing our theories and our definitions in psychology. So what we did to look at how people understand mind wandering is we went on MTurk, so Mechanical Turk on Amazon, and we got 353 participants where each of them rated one vignette. So this was a between subjects design where we wanted to look at where all the manipulations were between subjects, not within subjects. We didn't want people making comparisons. And we wanted to look at how different manipulations affected people's judgments of mind wandering. So what they would do is they'd see a vignette that describes someone named Susan who's having some thoughts, having some experiences. And we would ask, how much do they agree with the following statement? Susan's mind is wandering a bit, rated on a Likert scale from 1 to 7. And we told them very explicitly that this wasn't about them like getting some quiz question right or like capturing what other people mean by mind wandering. We were really interested in their understanding of the term. This is what we were trying to get at. So what we did is we manipulated 2 features. We actually manipulated 3 features of thought, but I'm only reporting 2 today because only 2 of those actually fit in with the stuff we were talking about. But the other feature of thought is actually something that we talked about. We've sort of like gestured at here, which is how much do you let your mind wander on purpose versus it just happens in spite of yourself. So I could tell you what the results are for that, but that's a different analysis. Anyways, so we manipulated 2 features of thought here. One is whether Susan's thoughts were off task, so whether she was doing her homework and thought about something else, or whether Susan had no task and she just was thinking, she's just doing nothing in particular, and she has some thoughts. If you think that mind wandering has to be off-task thought, has to be thought that wanders away from something, then you should think that this would be the primary driver of people's intuitions about mind wandering. The other thing we manipulated is whether Susan's thoughts were freely moving from one topic to another, the sort of movement that I've talked about, or whether she was guided to remain on topic. So here's how we did the first manipulation about the no task, off task. Was pretty simple. It was pretty straightforward. So we did at the start of the vignette is that Susan is in the off-task condition. She's supposed to be doing her homework when she finds herself thinking about something else. Then we just described her experiences. In the no-cast condition, Susan is lounging around, not doing anything in particular when she finds herself thinking about something else. So if you think that mind wandering has to be off-task, has to be thought that wanders away from something, then you should think that this should be the most significant driver. This manipulation should be the most significant driver of mind wandering. Now the second manipulation was much harder to do well in a controlled manner. But I think we've got a method that actually works. So we wanted to manipulate the dynamics of thoughts, how her thoughts are moving over time. But that's really challenging to do in a controlled way. And here's an example to illustrate why that was so challenging. So what we originally wanted to do is we wanted to compare vignettes. In one vignette, Susan would be really focused on something, so she'd be focused on sort of a list of groceries or her grocery shopping that she wants to do. It's like working through a to-do list, classic case of guided thought like the one I told you before today. In the other case, Susan's mind is wandering, say, from a camping trip to a party, to an old friend that she met at the party. This is what we originally did. But I wasn't convinced by this manipulation because say we find a difference between these 2. What we don't know is whether this difference really concerns the dynamics of thought. Is the difference because Susan's mind is wandering from one topic to another? Or is the difference because people just thinking about happy things like camping and partying and old friends, that's mind wandering, right? Whereas thinking about boring things like groceries, that's not mind wandering. So we really wanted to be able to find some way to manipulate the dynamics while keeping the topics constant. And this is how we did that. So the topics were, we actually had 3 vignettes that were focused. So one, Susan was thinking about groceries. So she has 3 sentences describe her experiences when she's thinking about groceries. And the other one, she was thinking about camping. So she had 3 experiences where she was thinking about planning a camping trip that she was going to go on in the weekend. And the other experience, she was thinking about how to prepare for her guitar recital. These were all cases of guided, goal-directed thought. So here's an example of one of these guided, goal-directed thoughts. And you actually should recognize parts of how we constructed this vignette from the philosophy, right? This is how the philosophy goes in and informs the experimental design. So Susan's supposed to be doing her homework when she finds herself thinking about the groceries she needs. She remembers some items from her grocery list: eggs, bread, milk, apples. She thinks about what meal she wants to cook this week and what ingredients she will need. Then she imagines walking through the grocery store aisles later today and thinks about what she will need to buy. So she has a bunch of thoughts about the same topic. Her thoughts aren't moving all the time. And crucially, she's also guided to remain on that topic. We don't use the word guidance, but we describe it. We say Susan is trying to focus on the groceries she needs, and if she gets distracted, she makes sure to return to this topic. And remember, the crucial part of guidance is, if you are distracted, would you feel pulled back? So we're building that into the vignettes of guided thinking. Any questions about the vignette? Okay. Yeah.
Why did you decide to use the supposed to be instead of she was doing that?
Yeah, because we wanted, that's a good question. So what we didn't want to do is, we wanted to allow that she was supposed to be doing her homework the whole time through. What we didn't want to say is, oh, she was doing her homework and then she started to do something else, right? Which is, to be honest, what I actually think is kind of going on in this case. I think that your task is switching, right? I don't really think that your mind is wandering. But we still wanted to put it in as sort of charitable way for everyone else, where like really what's happening is she's not doing this task the whole time, right? So we wanted to have as much as possible to communicate that she was off task. But I sort of see the worry about it being normative. And that's something actually that's important, I think, about the sort of ordinary definition of mind wandering, is that people really do think it's like bad when your mind wanders, right? Like in saying that mind wandering is off-task thought, that often in a lot of people equates to meaning that mind wandering is like you're not doing what you're supposed to do, right? And I think that that's how a lot of people sort of think about mind wandering, at least in psychological literature, and also in sort of Western thought dating back to like Christian theologians. They hate mind wandering, right? Like Thomas Aquinas thinks it's a sin. So yeah, I think that that's part of that sort of normative dimension really is part of our sort of ordinary, how people understand the notion of task and related thought. But yeah, it's a good question. So what we have is, using that, we construct 3 vignettes, all of which are focused. They're goal directed. One about groceries, one about planning a camping trip, one about planning a guitar recital. Then what we did is we constructed an unguided vignettes by taking sentences from these guys. So we had one sentence from groceries that goes down here, one sentence about camping that goes down here, one sentence about a guitar recital that goes down here, and we did that to construct 3 different wandering vignettes using that same method, where we actually just took the sentences from the focus vignettes and jumbled them up to get mind wandering. So here's an example of a wandering vignette. Susan's supposed to be doing her homework when she finds herself thinking about other things. She remembers some items from her grocery list: eggs, bread, milk, apples. So that's just taken directly from the vignette that you saw. Then she imagines the tune of the song she'll play at her guitar recital next week. Then she imagines the route that she will drive to the campgrounds on her upcoming camping trip. So these were taken from the other focused vignettes. And we also gave a description that on our philosophical view would imply that Susan's mind is unguided. Susan doesn't focus on any of these thoughts for long, and when she switches topics, she simply moves on, so there's nothing that sort of draws her back. So what's really important about this is when you look at all the sentences combined in these 3 focus vignettes, and you compare them to the sentences in these, they're exactly matched, right? So if there's any difference here, it can't be due to the content of what Susan was thinking about in the 2 cases. It has to be due to the dynamics of thoughts and to how Susan's attention was either guided or unguided. So what we think is we have a manipulation that actually does manipulate dynamics without manipulating the topics that Susan is thinking about. So the results, here's a sort of summary of, and like I'm also a philosopher, so my Spanish is broken and my charts are ugly. So here's a chart with the marginal means for each condition. So what you can see is 2 things. One is both whether Susan's thoughts were guided or freely moving. That had a significant effect on whether subjects deemed that she was mind wandering, and so did whether she was off task or on task. What's also important is to notice the interaction here. So when Susan's thinking was guided, when she was goal directed, then it mattered whether she was off task or on task, right? So that matters, people said, about mind wandering. But that doesn't matter when Susan's mind is freely moving. When we have these paradigm cases of mind wandering, this off-task, on-task thing is just irrelevant. So when it comes to thinking about the cases that psychologists, I think, really care about, when you look at the kind of cases they describe that people in the mind wandering literature really care about, this on-task, off-task thing doesn't matter all that much. So what we can see this a little bit more rigorously with a two-way ANOVA. What we did is we predicted subjects' mind wandering ratings with the dynamics of thought, so whether they were guided or free, and their task, whether they were off task and no task. And again, this is between subjects and ANOVA. So what we find again is that as it looked like in the picture, the dynamics were significantly related to subjects' mind wandering ratings, as were the task, and as were the interaction between them, right? But I think what's really interesting here is to look at the effect size. So eta squared or eta squared, again, like this psychology is a second language. So is it eta or eta? I don't know what the Greek letter is, how that's pronounced. Eta? Yeah, okay. So eta squared is a measure of how much, roughly speaking, how much of the variance we're explaining by with each of these factors. And what's important to notice is that we're explaining almost three times as much variance by looking at dynamics as we do by looking at whether Susan was off task or on task. Right? So the standard definition explains far less of people's folk judgments of mind wandering than this sort of new definition of mind wandering as dynamics. So another way of looking at this is by thinking about Cohen's rules of thumb for thinking about how large an effect size is, whether it's small, medium, or large. A 0.06 effect size is consistent with like a small to medium effect size in psychology. It's like just passes the 0.06 threshold for medium-sized effects. A 0.17 effect size far passes the threshold for a large effect in psychology. That threshold is 0.14. So we're seeing dynamics makes a big difference in what people's judgments are about mind wandering. Whereas whether they're on task or off task or have no task doesn't make that, it makes somewhat of a difference, but far less. So what does this mean, sort of theoretically or philosophically speaking? This means that people's judgments of mind wandering actually are an amalgam between at least two different concepts, right? So between whether the dynamics and the off task, on task. But the dynamics is by far the most significant factor. So that means that current definitions of psychology and this sort of research on mind wandering in the last 20 years, they've been ignoring most of what people mean when they say mind wandering, right? So again, I think what we need to do, and this is going back to this sort of paper that I read by Diego like 10 years ago, to theorize about mind wandering, you need to think about the stream of consciousness, not just whether, if we want to theorize about mind wandering, we want to measure mind wandering, this thing that people actually do talk about, the phenomenon in common sense psychology, we need to be able to theorize about and measure how the stream of consciousness moves over time, not just whether thoughts, tasks are related. So any more questions about this experiment? Sure.
Not about the experiment, but
sure.
About what you said of the previous view of mind wandering
sure,
and
yeah.
the new approach you're looking at it now.
Yeah.
What do you think about all the conclusions that have been drawn due to this previous view of mind wandering that maybe ignored a big part of it?
Yeah. So I think that those previous conclusions were it was really important to get the field to where it is today. So 20 years, so go back to, well, I guess 17 years ago. Go back to, well, but maybe 20. Go back to like 1997, right? And think about where the field of psychology was. Insofar as we ever talked about rest in cognitive neuroscience or in cognitive psychology, and insofar as we ever talked about mind wandering, it was always this thing that you want to ignore, right? It was like in neuroscience, rest was literally, it was noise that you could, against which you could compare your real data, like the real cognitive processes. And I think that there's one paper that I really like that argues that came out of this sort of dogma from behaviorism, where in behaviorism, you can only study something if you can like give it, like the only real things are things that you can study with a task, right? And we can't study mind wandering with a task, so it must be nothing. And I think what the field of task and related thought showed that there's a whole lot of the mind that can't just be studied by looking at tasks, right? That we have to study people's experiences when they're not doing anything. And I think that was really good to moving the field to where it is. But, as I have said, I do think that the field, in order to progress, I do think that it needs to carve up our sort of concepts of mind wandering more finely, and needs to get at the dynamics of thought. And that's hopefully what I'm trying to do with the sort of methods that I'm going to talk about in the end of the talk, ones that are trying to measure how thought moves over time.
And another question related to this, what's your view on mind wandering and mental health according to all these previous theories or views?
So here's a good example of that. So there's this paper by Dan Gilbert, Gilbert and I forgot the other. It's called "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind," by Gilbert and I'm forgetting his graduate student's name, which is terrible. So, anyways, Dan Gilbert and his Killingsworth and Matt Killingsworth. So Dan Gilbert and Matt Killingsworth had this paper called "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind," where they purported to show that like mind wandering causes unhappiness, right? So it's not only that we're unhappy when our minds is wandering. They argued, and I think methodology that I don't exactly agree with, that like there's a causal connection where mind wandering makes you less unhappy. It's a bad thing, right? And they've also had studies, Dan Gilbert had a study where like people would shock themselves rather than mind wander. So he really hates mind wandering. He thinks it's really bad for well-being. But that was based on this notion of mind wandering as task and related thought. So what we don't know is, in fact, actually we do know now, because there's some studies that I won't talk about that are in press on this. But what we don't know is whether those relationships between task and related thought and happiness, insofar as they exist, are driven by mind wandering, your thought is wandering from freely moving from one thing to another, or whether they're driven by rumination, right? Where you're obsessively thinking about really bad things. Which, like, yeah, it makes you unhappy, because that's the point, is to make you think about unhappy things. That's what its purpose is, that's what its function is. And it turns out that when you actually look at some of the results, one of the results we've got from one of the studies that I will report, I'm not reporting the result here, but that there is actually a relationship where the focused thought tends to be less happy than less of a positive valence than sort of freely moving thought. So it's exactly as we predicted, that kind of relationship between task and related thought and well-being is actually going to be mediated by the types of task and related thought that people have to be having in that experiment. And we can do a lot just by rerunning those studies that this would do. Right?
And specifically with disorders such as ADHD or an OCD.
Yeah. So here's the story that goes with mind wandering and ADHD and OCD in the literature. Oh, mind wandering is associated with both ADHD and OCD. Look, it's so bad, right? When you look at the experiences of someone who has ADHD versus the experiences of someone who has OCD, they couldn't be more different, right? Like one is obsessing about the same thing over and over again, and the other one is someone like me whose mind like flits from one thing and you can never catch what I'm thinking about at any moment, and I'll shift without notice. Right? Those look like very different kinds of thoughts. And again, I think that you need that kind of a framework where you distinguish between mind wandering, between sticky thoughts, affectively sticky thoughts, and between goal-directed thoughts, to be able to distinguish between what's going on in those various clinical conditions. Yes, this is a great question. So on to the last experiment of how we can actually begin to test some of those things in an empirical context. So again, what we've made so far is a philosophical point in both a priori philosophy and in experimental philosophy, that mind wandering and task unrelated thought are not the same thing. So there are good philosophical reasons to think they're not the same thing. There are also good reasons by looking at what ordinary people believe to think that they're not the same thing. But there is an open empirical question still about whether, as a matter of contingent fact, when you look at the data, whether all mind wandering happens to be task unrelated thought or vice versa. So I just said, in response to the question, name?
Nicholas.
In response to Nicholas's question, I said, well look, all of these results might be driven by one kind of task-related thought rather than the other. But maybe not, right? So imagine that, so this is an open possibility for what I've told you. It happens to be that when people have task-unrelated thoughts, their minds do always wander, right? Like people very rarely are maybe in a talk and have a goal-directed train of thoughts about something else where they deliberately and methodically work through a to-do list. Maybe when people's minds are wandering during a talk or during a lecture or during a psych experiment, their minds are always drifting from one thing to another. And maybe when they're paying attention, they never, and like on task, they don't have these sort of freely moving thoughts. They almost always have a sort of focused, goal-directed thoughts. If that's the case, then even though we're not defining mind wandering the right way conceptually speaking, we're still capturing all that we would care about with this sort of dynamic definition of mind wandering. So we wanted to see whether there really was an empirical, whether those two things were empirically differentiable in people's actual experiences. So we did in the first study, there was a lab study and there was a study in the world. In the laboratory study, we had 40 participants. Actually, I think this is like 70 participants, but for some reason I was dropping a bunch of participants, so I need to reanalyze the data. So we had like 70 participants. They answered 13 thought sampling questions, 13 questions each. And while they were doing a mind-numbingly boring task. So you're sitting there in the lab, you're pressing left when you see a left arrow, you're pressing right when you see a right arrow, and you're doing that for like an hour. And it's horrible. And you're really bored, and you think about other things. Well, it's probably not horrible, because your mind is wandering, and that's fun. So we asked them two questions about one, were your thoughts task unrelated, it's the standard question, and two, were your thoughts wandering from one thing to another, were they focused? And what we needed to do, and this is where the philosophy comes in, we needed to give people descriptions of training to be able to identify those kind of thoughts, what we meant by those abstract categories. What we did to do that is give them an abstract descriptions of the type of thought that we had in mind, drawn from the philosophy in the sort of theoretical work. We gave them vignettes or examples of thought, like the ones that I've given you today, right, of someone whose mind is wandering during a lecture. And we also, at the end, gave them a quiz, where they'd be presented with various vignettes, and they had to classify them correctly as task-unrelated or not, or freely moving or not, in order to move on to the main part of the experiment. And most people were able to do that. So the task-unrelated thought question was pretty standard. Immediately before this probe, so the probe is a question. Were you thinking about something other than the arrow's task? Not at all, or completely. Pretty standard. The wandering question, which we didn't actually mention the word wandering in it, but I'm just putting that in there because I'm theoretically biased. Immediately before this probe, was your mind moving freely from one thing to another, or were you focused on something in particular? So you'd be completely focused, or your mind was completely wandering. So we needed instructions to be able to explain what that meant. What we did is gave them an abstract description of completely focused thoughts and completely wandering thoughts. Here was the description for wandering thoughts. Your thoughts move freely when there's no overarching purpose or direction to your thinking. So again, it's not that you're sticking on one topic, you're moving from topic to topic. And your mind may drift between your internal thoughts and immediate surroundings, but doesn't focus on any one thing for long. So as with Hector's point, like you might be moving in and out, right? You might be thinking about your computer screen and then your internal experiences. But what's crucial for this is not, as Daniela pointed out, whether you were having perceptual thoughts or internal thoughts, but rather how your thoughts were moving over time, whether they're moving quickly or focusing on anything for long. Then we provided similar abstract or opposite abstract descriptions of focused thoughts. Then we gave people vignettes, one where your mind was wandering, and 3 where you were engaged in focused thinking, right? So one of them, you were on task, you were really paying attention to the arrow's task, nothing else was going through your mind. One of them, your thoughts were goal-directed, so you were directing your thoughts towards some goal that you had, like a to-do list or a quiz that you had next week, I think that was the example. And then 3 is that your thoughts were sticky, they were affectively stuck on something. So this is an example where the examples we gave them were they had a fight with their friend, or they kept thinking over and over again about pizza that they really wanted to eat because they were hungry and they wanted to get at the experiment. So So then we had to give them quizzes where they, again, had other vignettes of experiences, and they had to rate those vignettes as task-unrelated thought or as mind-wandering. And participants actually did quite well. We dropped participants who I think got like less than 6 out of 8, so got almost less than perfect, and we had to drop just only a few. So the results. So what would you predict if you thought that mind-wandering was task-unrelated thought, as a matter of contingent empirical fact? So even though the things are conceptually distinct, in the real world they always come together. What you would think is that there'd be very little on-task thought that's freely wandering, and there'd be very little off-task thought that is focused, and then all thoughts, or close to it, would be in these 2 cells, right? And thus that there'd be a strong and significant correlation, but one that's also quite strong between mind-wandering and task-unrelated thought. That's not what you see. What you do see is that there's a significant correlation between the different categories, but that the strength is quite small. So this is consistent with a pretty small R, something like Cohen's rules of thumb. What you also see is that there's a significant percentage of thoughts in all of the quadrants, not just thoughts in these 2 quadrants. So they're pretty evenly distributed between the different types of thoughts. So it looks like if you thought that this was all of experience, you'd be ignoring about 47% of people's subjects' thoughts in our experiments. That's a lot to just not quantify. So if we wanted to replicate this, though, in an experimental and an everyday context, yeah, go ahead.
How many times did you ask every participant?
13.
13 times?
Yes.
Okay. You mean this hour-long task?
Yes. So it was 13 times because there's another task that we weren't recording here, where we wanted to see whether waking someone up from mind wandering made them have more dispersed thoughts on a semantic fluency test. So that reduced the number of probes that we would ordinarily be having for you.
And if you look just at the first trial for each individual, we have the same pattern?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know.
I mean, just to see if there's kind of expectation bias?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, and I should look at that with the data. Yeah, that's cool. And I think that if you had more probes, like if I was just concerned with this, I might run it with like 40 trials per subject. And I think it'd be really interesting to look at block effects, like timing effects of how your thoughts change over time. Yeah, that's a great question, because one of the results from the literature is that as blocks go on, at least in difficult tasks, people's minds tend to, in experimental tasks, their minds tend to start wandering more. And I'd be really curious about whether that's due to just off-task thought or freely moving thought in particular. Yeah?
5 minutes?
Sure. So the experiment 2, we did the same thing but on like a cell phone. So asked subjects what were they thinking on their everyday thoughts. Were you thinking about something other than what you were doing? And was your mind moving about freely? So same questions we asked before. And we trained them not with a sort of computer task because there was too many of them. We gave a PowerPoint session where we got abstract descriptions and examples and they asked questions. So again, this is the pattern of results you'd expect if mind wandering was the same thing empirically as task unrelated thought, and it's not what you find. So you find a very similar pattern with a weak but significant correlation between the different categories and a significant number of thoughts in each of these cells, so it replicates across different experiments. And I think that what we need to do with the future research is we can use these things to see if self-reported mind wandering does track objective differences in people's neural activity, like the sort of predictions that we reported earlier, in their subsequent behavior, like what we've talked about in the questions about whether mind wandering makes you more creative, and then also in clinical conditions. Again, I think this is a really important prediction of the view that certain clinical conditions should be associated with certain streams of thought, and other clinical conditions should be associated with others. And happiness is another case. But I think this is really important to see whether we're not just tracking differences in people's what they report, right? What they feel like they're supposed to report, but tracking real differences in experience. So what I've told you about today, I've answered a specific question about how do you define mind wandering. I've given you a definition. But we've also seen a little bit about how I would approach definitions in general in psychology. So how do you approach defining the mind as a philosopher or a psychologist? And what I sort of implicitly argued for is a sort of methodological pluralism, where you draw on the methods of a lot of fields, and those converge, hopefully, on a sort of single answer. So I've given you philosophical analysis on what mind wandering is, where you just sort of give this sort of a priori reasoning, giving sort of cases and intuitions about mind wandering. I've also given you a neuroscientific model, how that might map onto the brain. I've given you work on experimental philosophy about how real people understand mind wandering. And I've also looked at actual people's experience by looking at their experience and seeing whether these definitions come apart. And I think that because it's so hard to give a definition like this, I think that it's really important to try and see whether these different kinds of definitions that can be in error and that have sort of independent variation, whether they converge on a single account of what mind wandering is. And I think that they do. And I think that that's a reason to be optimistic that we can use these kind of methods to begin to empirically study something that's remained elusive for centuries, the stream of thought. But thanks.
Do you know other researchers who are also doing different methods for studying mind wandering?
So not the dynamics really. So the dynamics, it's really I'm doing it. Kalina Christoph's lab is really engaged in this too, but we co-authored that paper. We're working on this together. Chandra Shipada is a researcher at Michigan. Who the experimental philosophy paper, I did that with him and Verity Pinter, who's an undergrad at Berkeley. So there's a few of us who are really trying to look at the dynamics, who are trying to quantify the stream of consciousness, but we're all sort of in the same sort of corner and all working together. The hope is that this takes off and that this becomes a sort of more established method that a lot of people use.
And what has been the response for this view of
Well, I think people. Well, I don't know. It's hard to tell yet. I mean, it's been the Nature Review Neuroscience paper did get a lot of uptake. Like it got a fair amount of press. It got a lot of it got for its age. It has a lot of citations. But we'll see. I don't know how people are going to whether it's gonna remain and whether it's gonna become a part of the field. And I hope so. But yeah.
Haven't you got response from other important mind-wandering researchers like maybe Smallwood or
Yeah. So Schooler thinks that it is important, and he wants us to have like a fight with Paul Selly in the literature, which I don't know whether we're going to do. But I think Schooler liked it, and Smallwood liked it as well. So those guys seem to be interested in the view. One of the other important views that's happening is Paul Selly has a research program looking at intentionally initiated versus spontaneously initiated mind wandering. And that's one that I think is actually distinct from ours. And that's, I think, a big question, is if people start taking out these views, do they get distinguished, which I think they should be.
And what's your view about Selly's vision of intentional versus not intentional? Because I've read your chapter from the forthcoming Oxford book of spontaneous thought.
Yeah.
And you have a graphic in the bottom part of the chapter which distinguishes between automatic constraints and deliberate constraints, and there you have goal-directed or mind-wandering. And when I read Selly's work, I'm thinking it would better be cataloged in the part of a goal-directed thought rather than...
Maybe, although the experimental philosophy, and it's not something I'm reporting here, that third factor that I told you about that I was varying, that I wasn't reporting, so is intentional initiation versus unintentional initiation. So this category is whether, so you ask someone, did you intentionally mind wander? I think really what he's asking is, did you let your mind wander on purpose? So often, say you're in a lecture and you find that a lot of mind wandering is really, we really do mean to mind wander. It's not happening by accident. It's not happening against our will. I think in many of those cases, it's going to be because we decide to think about another goal, and that's how it was originally thought of in the literature. But what's interesting is, again, if you look at like the language people use to talk about mind wandering, let is like a really common colloquial of mind wandering in both Spanish and English. Like you say, like dejar volar. That means like I let my mind wander, right? Like, or in English you say like I let my mind wander. It's the most common colloquial of mind wandering. I think it's something that we let happen all the time. And in the experimental philosophy paper, we find that people do really separate these things. People think that you can, so the fact we vary is whether you intentionally let your mind wander on purpose or not. And that doesn't predict. That's actually the weakest predictor of subjects' ratings of mind wandering. So I think it really can be both. Yeah.
If there is any neurological pattern that can show you, like you showed us, when someone is mind wandering, what if experimentally you put someone doing a task, and then after the task you ask them how many times did you mind wander? And then see if their answer is the same as the electro.
I mean, that's basically, I think, something that's really important to do, is to see whether these sort of neural patterns predict, how often your mind is wandering during a task. And that's something that I hope that I think Big Fish is working on. Something very similar.